due to the pandemic. I hope that everything will go as well as it did last year and that our scientific interaction will be still fruitful, even if the conference is only held virtually. Before starting, I would like to thank the Department of Economics at Roma Tre for its organizational support, and the Italian Association of Labor Economists, the European Association of Evolutionary Political Economy, and the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence for their sponsorships. I would also like to thank Professor Saraceno and Professor Dosi for accepting our invitation to give respectively the opening and concluding speeches of our conference. It is also an honor for us to have tomorrow morning at our conference the Italian Minister of Labour and Social Policies, Andrea Orlando, and the rector of our university, Professor Carlo Pietromarchi. The theme of the conference is the topical issue of the macroeconomic, structural and social effects of the national recovery and resilience plans. In Europe, recovery after the COVID-19 pandemic crisis is still uncertain, below the previous income trend, and strictly related to the implementation of these national plans. They are intended to foster labor productivity and the pace of economic growth, as well as ecological transition and social cohesion, facing therefore, in addition to the pandemic crisis, the long-term processes of social polarization and secular stagnation that had already taken place over the last decades in the major industrialized European countries. However, concerns have been raised over the adequacy of the amount of resources planned for the next generation EU, a future lack of coordination between fiscal and monetary policies, and the effects on the labor market of the structural changes caused by the ecological transition and automation in industrial and service sectors of the economy. The 5th International Astril Conference has brought together contributions in these fields and possibly policy measures capable of reducing income and wealth inequality caused by the COVID-19 crisis. We have received in this respect a large number of papers and have organized 3 plenary sessions and 9 parallel sessions with a total of 43 presentations. They concern mainly macroeconomic issues, in particular the need for and possible effects of changes in the institutional setting of the European Union, as well as the effects of the fiscal stimulus planned in Europe. However, several contributions also focus on the need for changes in work organization, the degree of workers' autonomy and labor legislation, as well as the need for new agreements between trade unions and employers' associations. Other contributions concern the reshaping of the welfare system after the COVID-19 pandemic and demonstrate the centrality of public health and income support measures. 2 plenary sessions have been organized on these specific themes, on the recent new metal workers agreement with participation from the General Director of Federmeccanica, Stefano Franchi, and the General Secretary of FIMCISL, Roberto Benaglia, and the other session on the welfare system, focusing especially on the citizenship income and its reform. Moreover, a parallel session organized by INPS with the participation of its president, Pasquale Tridico, will discuss how the implementation of a minimum wage by law can be combined with union bargaining. That's all for now. I don't want to take any more time away from Professor Saraceno's lecture. Before he speaks, I would like to briefly give the floor to Professor Pietrobelli, director of our department, and Professor Fadda, the president of INAP. I only remember that the official languages of the conference are both Italian and English, but of course it would be better to speak in English, even with an Italianized English as mine. And so please, Professor Pietrobelli, I give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Sergio. My role is to really give a warm welcome to all the participants. I'm very happy that once again we can host this prestigious seminar, and I congratulate Sergio and the Astril and the organization for convening so many different papers. We're going to have 43 papers, 9 parallel sessions, 3 plenary sessions, so really a lot of excellent research work that we're very proud to host at our department. These are topics that are, as we all know, very timely. We're going to discuss about macro as well as structural as well as social, all in the flavor of the current economic policy decisions regarding the design and implementation of the recovery and resilience plan. So everything very timely. And this is confirmed by the presence of the Minister Orlando tomorrow and our Rector Luca Pietromarchi. So really a prestigious occasion, and I'm sure it's going to be a fruitful discussion among us during these 2 days. Let me welcome again you all, and let me thank the administration of the department and all our colleagues that are making this possible. I mean, it seems to be easier to organize things from a distance, but we have, as Sergio is smiling, but we have the challenge of having different sessions and parallels and connections and everything. So I hope everything goes well, but we're having an excellent start, and I'm very happy of this and thankful with the administration of our department. So let me conclude here. Enjoy these 2 days, and thanks again.
Thanks, Carlo. And so I now give the floor to Sebastiano Fadda, president of INAP, and also the previous president of Astril. So I am very happy to give to him the floor.
Thank you very much, Sergio. I am really glad to welcome all the participants in this fifth conference of this association. And as Sergio hinted, I am particularly glad as past president and co-founder of this association, which is now led by Professor Sergio Levero, and is developing many lines of research in the field of labor market. The National Institute for the Analysis of Public Policy, the INAP, is deeply engaged in research in this field in 2 directions. First, in creating several databases, data banks, as a member of the system, National Statistical System of Italy, and engaged also in the policy-oriented analysis with the aim of creating a knowledge platform as a point of reference for decision makers, and possibly as the approach of the evidence-based policy. The inspiring approach that we have in the Institute is that of the structural change and structural dynamics. In this time, and under the acceleration of the pandemic, the structural change has been receiving an impulse, a strong impulse, both in the composition of the PIL, the national product, and the final demand, and also in the change of the technical coefficient of production, particularly in the coefficient of labor. Now the problems that we faced are those of the recovery of the economy, with the problems of selecting the investments, and the problem of the financial stability also, and the link, as it has been mentioned, between monetary policy and real policies. But of particular relevance are the problems related to the impact of this structural change and the pandemic on the world of labor. And this impact is particularly relevant in three dimensions. First is the quantitative dimension. The rate of employment is too low, is still too low in Italy, and this creates problems both of poverty and of sustainability of pension schemes and welfare. The second point is the impact on the quality of labor. We still have a rising amount of non-standard work, part-time, short-time work, and different work on platforms and so on, which create a great inequality and poverty. And the third point is the problem of reallocation of labor due to the structural change, the transitions between sectors, transitions between tasks imply some solution of problems in the skills and the upskilling of labor force, and also of financing the periods of unemployment, which may remain in between the movement from one workplace to another. So the problems of social security, unemployment benefits, and so on. So there is a wide range of problems which affect the labor market, and many of these are reflected in the contribution that are going to be presented in this conference. So I wish all of the participants and the speakers of the conference a good work, and we are waiting to have ideas and the contribution on the theoretical and also empirical level on these themes. So have a good working time in these 2 days. Thank you.
Thank you, Sebastiano. Thank you again, Carlo, for your speeches. And so now I give the floor to Francesco Saraceno. You will have, 45-50 minutes for your lecture, and then perhaps 10 minutes for discussion. Okay, Francesco? So
thank you very much, Sergio, Sebastiano, Carlo, for the invitation. Thanks to Astril and to the department. I'm really sorry that we still have to be in front of a screen and not in person, but I mean, that's life, and let's hope it's really the last time we see each other like that. So I was asked by Sergio, and Sergio contacted me to contribute to this conference. I was asked to give a sort of general perspective of where we stand on the macroeconomics of the recovery plan. And so what I decided to do was to, and then we knew already that we would enter into a phase of debate, discussion on the reform of European institutions. And so what I decided to do is to sort of give you a wider than the scope of the conference perspective on where Europe comes from, and more importantly, I think, where it is going to. So let me share with you my slides. I apologize. This should be the one. Can you see it?
Yes, Francesco, we see.
Yes.
And let me just put it in presentation mode. Okay, so let me move the window. Okay, so we're good to go. So what I try to do, I will very quickly go over something we all know, we discussed at length in the past few years, at least since 2010. So where we come from. So where does Europe come from? Europe comes from a big missed opportunity that was the global financial crisis. And it comes from an institutional setup. It is still today characterized by an institutional setup that is really was really shaped by the consensus that dominated in macroeconomics in the 90s. So we'll quickly go over these elements just to give you some element of context. And then I will show you that there was a big game changer, first game changer actually in 2008, 2009 with the global financial crisis. And that led to a quite interesting, it's quite a good moment today to be a macroeconomist, process of rethinking macroeconomics and borrowing the expression from a series of conferences that Olivier Blanchard held at the IMF. That process of rethinking macroeconomics had a very hard time making it into Europe. Europe remained linked and backward-looking, if you want, all across the sovereign debt crisis. The game changer for us, for Europe, was clearly COVID, where instead, to my surprise, I must say, in 2020, Europe acted quite boldly, quite quickly, and I would say quite effectively. So, and that, of course, leads to the most important part of my presentation, to my view, which is what's next. So once Europe finally seemed to have got its act together and finally learned how to deal with macroeconomic shocks and to plan about the future, and this is the scope of the conference, actually, seeing how we're planning and how we're trying to structurally modify our institutions. We are clearly in a new world. Maybe macroeconomics is not there yet. The theoretical and empirical work in macroeconomics is not there yet, but clearly the policy world is in a world where we have a new kid in town, and this new kid in town is fiscal policy. So we'll try to discuss a little bit the trade-off that is appearing very clearly now between the need to give fiscal space to either European countries or to the European Union through a central fiscal capacity, and the necessity to manage both the legacy of past debt, but also the debt that we are certainly going to have to build up in the future to face the challenges that Sergio and Sebastiano were mentioning in their introduction. So let me start very quickly. These are things, I mean, we especially with this crowd, I can be very quick. There is a sort of play in three acts that happens between the 70s and the 80s that leads to the dismissal of the Keynesian theory. The first act, which in my view is the most important, is the debate on the Phillips curve, when Friedman, Phelps, and others introduced the concept of natural output. And once introduced the concept of natural output, they distinguish between the short and the long run relationship between prices and unemployment, and they conclude that with agents learning from their past mistakes, in the end, in the long run, the Phillips curve becomes vertical, and the trade-off between prices and employment disappears. Then there are refinement of that main results that I see these as refinement. The first is, of course, rational expectations, in which demand still has a role in the short run in getting the economy away from the natural rate, but eventually it jumps back into the to natural output, and the sort of extreme version of that is real business cycle, where even fluctuations in your business cycle fluctuations are attributed to supply side factors. But let me repeat once again that the dismissal of macroeconomic policy and the irrelevance of macroeconomic policies is already a result that we have with the Friedman results on the long run vertical Phillips curve. Because once you lose the trade-off between prices and employment, or prices and unemployment, of course the economy settles on the long run attractor of the economy without any need by macroeconomic policy. The theory, the mainstream that emerges between the mid 80s and the late 90s, the so-called very non-Keynesian, actually new Keynesian model, is a sort of mix of RBC and and it's an RBC model with rigidities, if you want, in which you have temporary deviations from the natural output that follows an RBC dynamics, and these are, of course, due to imperfections, rigidities of different types, real and nominal, that both cause the natural output to diverge from the optimal output, and they also cause deviation in the short run and the opening of output gaps. Okay. All the subsequent literature, no matter how much it was refined, modified, reformed, made complex by introduction of rigidities, of heterogeneity, etc., does not lose this idea that there is a natural rate as an attractor. And so no matter how complex the subsequent DSG literature has been made to try to make it fit with the real world, sometimes with quite some success. I mean, there are lots of these models that carry very interesting results. Nevertheless, never abandon the idea that there is a sort of natural attractor to the economy that basically does not need macroeconomic policy to play a major role. Macroeconomic policy just speeds up, in some cases, the return to the natural output. In some sense, this is a sort of other way of saying that no matter how much you can complexify and try to tamper with the DSG model, you will never change its fundamental nature. And of course, once you have this result that policy is irrelevant, you have the standard policy prescriptions, on which I can also be very quick. Structural reforms are the best way to act because they reduce rigidities. What matters is the reduction of uncertainty, because fundamentally efficient markets work better in situations where you have no uncertainty. So you need nominal stability, and you need mostly rules that anchor the expectations of agents. And last but not least, this is a side result of the theory, but it's quite relevant in the current context, of course. There is a ranking between monetary and fiscal policy, and monetary policy is not subject to biases and lags, needs to be preferred to fiscal policy. I repeat, these are all things we know very well. I can be very quick. I also think is by now quite consensual that these consensus and these policy prescriptions, this idea about economic policy, was embedded into the Maastricht Treaty and into the Amsterdam Treaty and the protocols next to the Amsterdam Treaty that gave us the Stability and Growth Pact. In fact, the Maastricht criteria to access to the euro, inflation, interest rates, and exchange rate, and so on and so forth, and public finances, are all nominal criteria, with the idea that real convergence was the job of markets, not of government. There are strong constraints. There is a fiscal rule that strongly constrains fiscal policy and basically limits fiscal policy to automatic stabilization. And of course, we have a strongly independent monetary central bank that has a very strict inflation mandate, which is, as you know, not quite different from what happens, for example, with the American Fed. And last but not least, I will have a slide, very quick detour on that. There is no real industrial policy. Basically, industrial policy is identified with the pursuit of competition. So the only job of the policymaker is to level the playing field and then let markets pick the most innovative sectors. So these institutions are the institutions that were created when the consensus was dominating, and with no surprise, they actually reflect that view of the world. Okay? These institutions led to a substantial inertia of macroeconomic and industrial policies, I should have added that to the slide, in the EU when compared to the United States. The first game changer is the global financial crisis. It's a game changer because it's a typically Keynesian crisis. It's a balance sheet recession. There is a deleveraging process that happens following the financial crisis that leads to an increase in private savings, a credit crunch, a drop in investment, and this aggregate demand shortfall is cannot be managed by the central banks, that quickly end up at the zero lower bound, and we enter into a liquidity trap. At that point, monetary policy resorts to unconventional tools, quantitative easing, forward guidance, the fact that we go into negative interest rates in many central banks, and so on and so forth. But of course, the monetary policy quickly loses traction, and since already the end of 2008, most advanced and emerging economies put together big stimulus plans. Big, I mean, compared to what has been happening since 2020, these are actually quite small, but I mean, significant stimulus plans, and so fiscal policy makes it back. It's taken off the closet where it had been for 30 years and makes it back among the in the toolbox of the policy maker. And that leads to a quite interesting, I would say, I mean, I repeat what I said before. I mean, there is not a better time, if there are students listening, there is not a better time to be a macroeconomist or to study macroeconomics than today, because compared to when I studied, there is so much going on. The debate is basically very wide-ranging. It goes from the size of multipliers to the importance of rules, to the reassessment of the importance of discretionary policies, of course, to the issue of public investment. I will come back to that in a moment. Inequality and its impact, not inequality as a moral issue, but an issue of economic efficiency has become quite important. What is the meaning of reforms? What are the reforms that should be done? When should reforms be done? There is no big bang, there is no jumping to the equilibrium as soon as a reform is implemented, and so on and so forth. So there is really no field of macroeconomics that is not today under discussion. It's quite a really interesting discussion. And just to link with what I said at the very beginning, the game changer, in my opinion, is the fact that now some economists are asking whether we should drop the idea that the economy fluctuates around a natural equilibrium. Because if we drop that, of course, we drop the pillar on which all the macroeconomic consensus of the past 40 years has been built. There is lots of empirical work. I'm just citing the one paper I like most by Fatas and Summers that shows how the short and the long run are not unrelated. So the fluctuations of income affect the natural equilibrium. So the natural equilibrium becomes a much less solid concept. And there is this quite interesting, quite fascinating quote by Janet Yellen when she was Fed chairman, saying that this link is now very clear in the data. So the short run affects the long run. This dichotomy that was the pillar of the consensus is disappearing. And of course, if that happens, the new Keynesian model, as I said before, kind of collapses. While that happened in the rest of the world, those of us who lived in Europe were quite frustrated because at home we were doing business as usual. The Greek crisis was interpreted as a public debt crisis, so the whole private debt accumulation that led to the global financial crisis was forgotten, and everybody focused on the public debt, first of Greece, but then also of Ireland, Spain, Portugal, even Italy, and so on and so forth. The idea, the narrative that I called elsewhere, the Berlin view, sorry, was that the so-called Club Med countries had public finances that were out of control, and so they had to do their homework to restore their competitiveness. And so it was these countries that were asked to actually adjust to try to get out of the crisis. Fiscal considered this combo, this sort of two arms policy prescription. On one side, austerity, fiscal consolidation, on the other, structural reforms. And no matter how that would compress domestic demand, that would not be a problem, because looking at the example of Germany, it was said that growth would be found into exports. And the institutional reform that we put together, that we implemented in that very same period, went in the same direction. The fiscal compact, the 6 and 2 pact, the banking union that was born incomplete, the ESM that was so much discussed in Italy in the past couple of years. All of these institutions taken together go in the same direction. Stricter rules and making sure that these rules are respected by strengthening compliance. Think of, I will come back to that, think of the European semester that was introduced as a sort of tool to coordinate the fiscal policies of member countries and to facilitate the interaction with the Commission. In the end, became yet another way for the Commission to pressure member states into following its recommendations, and all the coordination part of the European semester is written on paper but never became applied. So Europe kind of made as if the global financial crisis had not happened, and as if the rethinking macroeconomics was taking all the old dogma and killing them. And so we lost a decade. I mean, we were discussing with Sergio and Sebastiano when I came to Roma in presence a couple of years ago to discuss with you, and at the time my reading of the European situation was very, very bleak, and I was very much depressed and pessimistic on the future development of Europe. Then came the second game changer, and this time, luckily for us, this game changer, luckily, I take it back, but I mean, luckily for the intellectual debate, the second game changer was also in Europe. The COVID crisis hit in 2020. It's an atypical crisis. At the same time, because of the lockdowns, we have both a demand and a supply, a drop both of demand and supply. So it's quite hard to manage using the standard tools that we got from the past. And the main challenge is for countries to try to preserve capacity, to avoid that capacity is deteriorated while it is artificially closed. It's as if we needed to give some, to keep alive the economy while we have put it into an artificial coma. And so on one side, preserve firms, on the other, preserve incomes and jobs. And that was mostly the task of national fiscal policies. The member country, we are not the United States of Europe, we don't have a central fiscal capacity. So the fiscal effort to both push to try to push up the capacity to treat the virus, to sustain the incomes, and to provide firms with the liquidity that would avoid them to go bankrupt was mostly, totally actually, the job of national governments. It was a very costly dam. This is the primary balance of European countries, as you have selected European countries. As you can see, the numbers are quite striking. It was quite interesting how automatic stabilization played quite a large role into the contrast to the crisis that would be the yellow part of this figure. As you can see it in most countries, except maybe France, it was well above 60%. And for Italy, for our country, it was most of the effort actually. And it was, of course, focused on labor market. These are figures taken from an IMF report. I'm sure you know. You can see that the job retention schemes were quite widespread. This is also another very interesting difference from 2008, when the only country that actually implemented job retention schemes was Germany. And the figures on the right show that these policies within the formal labor market, of course, they couldn't touch the informal labor market, but these policies managed to actually protect the weaker categories on labor markets, the lower skilled, partially women and the younger people. Just to give you an example, to use my personal experience, I live in Paris. Just to give you the example of France. In France, very quickly it was put in place, and very smoothly actually, a system of activité partielle, it's a job retention scheme in which 70% of the wage was paid by the government. It was renewed until last June, actually, and costed a ton of money. To use an expression of my adoptive president, un pognon de dingue. And there's still, up in December 2020, we're still more than 2 million workers that were covered by this measure. I don't think I need to explain you guys to this crowd, what is the advantage of job retention schemes compared to unemployment benefits. You keep alive the working relationship, you keep alive all the nexus of a firm-worker relationship that goes well beyond the pecuniary transaction that passes through a wage. And so the importance of job retention schemes is that when the economy recovers, the rebound is much faster. And I repeat, that is a lesson we learned the hard way from Germany in 2008. The dam was very expensive, but was quite successful. This is just, the simplest way I have to show you that these measures, while they cost a lot of money, they were successful, is to compare the drop in GDP at the Eurozone level with these numbers are actually wrong. There's something wrong with my slides. When I send you the slides, I will correct it because the real GDP drop is too high. But regardless of the actual numbers, wages and employment fell much less than economic activity. So there was a success in supporting incomes. Very quick side note. I described a very successful policy experiment. Let's not forget that we are on the right side of the world. This is an IMF, it's taken from an IMF fiscal monitor, and it shows that actually the privilege of contrasting the crisis with fiscal tools, either with the yellow bar, which is the guarantees given to firms and loans, and the green bar and the red bar that is more traditional spending and tax cuts. This privilege is just a rich country privilege. Even the emerging economies did much less than us, and in the low income economy, fiscal policy was basically inertial because of the lack of fiscal space, because of the lack of because of the market pressure on government debt. So it's the only moment in which I will go beyond Europe. We should not forget that we are speaking about a part of the world that has been in the best position to fight the pandemics, and don't even get me started on the availability of vaccines, of course. The fact that the first line of defense against the pandemics was national governments doesn't mean that Europe didn't do anything. Europe actually acted, as I said before, quite quickly and quite boldly. First, with the ECB that basically supported both firms and more specifically small and medium enterprises by expanding its refinancing operations and conditioning them to the borrowing at small firms. So basically, the central bank would give subsidies because it would lend at negative rates to financial institutions under the condition that these financial institutions kept the flow of credit to small and medium enterprises going. And then, of course, the flagship measure, which is the pandemic emergency purchase program, the PEP, so-called, that is still open. It will be closed in a couple of months in March. It is almost 2 trillion euros. It was increased in subsequent phases as the crisis became more and more important. And as everybody knows, the most important thing about the PEP actually is, of course, it's a lot of money, and it kept the interest rates low, especially for some countries like Italy. That was quite important. But what is, I think, more important is that the ECB, for the first time, deviated from the self-imposed capital ease, meaning that it stood ready to buy at least at least during the transition, debt according not to how much capital countries had into the ECB, but according to the need to keep their interest rates low and debt sustainable. And that, of course, was the fact that it did it so swiftly and so quickly shows how deep the crisis was. On the frugal countries, ECB governors didn't say a word about that. The Commission also did its job, so it basically got out of the way in some sense by activating the escape clause of the Stability Pact. So the Stability Pact still is there, but countries cannot be sanctioned. It can be and cannot be put in excessive deficit procedure, and softening state aid rules. And I think this tweet by Ursula von der Leyen, it made me laugh at the time. I remember imagining the German president of the Commission say that we need to pump money in the economy with a small emoticon. Was actually quite funny, I would say, but shows that the Commission was very aware that the effort of member states needed not to be to face any obstacles from the Commission. The second big, the second arm of the help by the Commission was, of course, financial assistance. Some money from the EU budget was found and immediately given to countries to finance the most urgent healthcare expenditure. It was quickly put in place a new tool called SURE that was supposed to finance government's expenditure to support the labor market. The famous or infamous ESM COVID line for for health-related expenditure, and finally the European Investment Bank, Investment Bank made it available a 200 billion for supporting firms. And the principle of all these tools is the same. The Commission or these funds and these institutions borrow at very low rate, preferential rates thanks to their credit ratings, and then they transfer the interest, the low interest to countries. And that for countries with high debt and higher interest rates, the savings could be significant. I will not enter into a debate that was very much Italian and quite alien to the rest of Europe between the difference between SURE and ESM. SURE was a big success. All the money, the 100 billion euros, were almost all of them, 95 of them were applied for by countries, and the Commission has and the fund has actually financed these countries, and 90 billion are already been disbursed. The ESM COVID line had zero demand, not only from Italy, as you may remember, but also from other countries. And I will not enter into debate. In just a sentence, SURE is a mechanism for solidarity, and so it does not bring with it conditionality. The ESM COVID line, in spite of being having lighter conditionality than the standard ESM credit lines, does not protect countries from a second round of macroeconomic adjustment requests, and so the risk for countries was too high, and no countries, I repeat, not just Italy, applied for it. It has a zero drawing from that credit line. If we go to if we project ourselves into the future, so I will go to the bulk of what I wanted to say today. Of course, the national dimensions fades out because we face challenges that can only be managed collectively at the European level. How to restart growth, how to actually restart growth while at the same time trying to steer our economy towards sustainable development and encouraging the ecological and, of course, not only the ecological, the digital transition, and of course manage this huge legacy of debt that comes from the and these are all tasks that, I repeat, cannot be tackled by individual countries and cannot be tackled without an active role of the government. And so fiscal policy not only came out of the closet because of the crisis, but will most likely remain out of the closet in the next few years. Okay. I don't think I need to go into the details of Next Generation EU. It's quite a substantial amount of money. The most important part of it is the recovery and resilience facilities, the recovery plans part. It's more or less half grants, half loans. It's only Italy got the loans among the largest European countries. It will be repaid, hopefully, with own resources in 2028. I was listening to the radio this morning, and apparently France is really trying to get, as the most important result of its presidency in the next 6 months, the implementation, at least the agreement on the carbon border tax. So that could be a short-term change. And of course, it is consistent with the work program of the von der Leyen Commission. So there is the requirement to spend a certain amount on green transition, digitalization, etc., etc. Okay, and these conditionalities are aimed at the conditionality on the scope on the destination of funds are meant to actually make plans that remain national, consistent, and all geared towards the same objective, which is, I repeat, the ecological transition. It is not an Hamiltonian moment, even if it needs to be underlined that Germany, by approving that, actually accepted some sort of temporary debt mutualization, because countries, for example, our country becomes a net beneficiary of the fund, while it is a net contributor to the European budget. But it's not an Hamiltonian moment because it's temporary, it's limited, and because the common borrowing is not used for common expenditure. There is no financing of a central fiscal capacity, but we finance national investment plans. So not yet an Hamiltonian moment. It might be in the future if it is successful and if it is a way to push forward a central fiscal capacity. Okay, and so there is a new kid in town, actually old, but who made a comeback, and this is fiscal policy. We saw how important it was to contrast fluctuation, so the standard Keynesian role. We are seeing how important it needs to be to finance and to manage long-term investment, and the industrial policy that apparently is coming back. It needs to be a major actor in the transition, both ecological and digital. It needs to be central in providing global public goods. It goes from vaccine to healthcare, etc., etc. There is a discussion that I think should be more developed on how much these things should be done, not at the national level, but at the European level. And of course, it needs to be active as long as monetary policy is bound by secular stagnation and by low interest rates. I remain in the team temporary. I think that the current inflation episode will fade out by itself in 2022, and we'll go back to a sort of deflationary environment. Okay, and of course, if you look at all of these challenges, and then you go back to one of my first slides on the Maastricht institutions, and you see that these these institutions simply seem to come from another era. Okay, and so it's really the fact that we need to change these institutions is now, I think, evident to everybody. Okay, so just a few words on public investment. There is a serious problem of public investment gap in most of Europe, including Germany. There is, of course, the need for for investment in new technologies and in financing the transition to this more sustainable world. But let's not forget that even traditional infrastructures are today we experience a gap even in traditional infrastructures, and and this is true, of course, for countries where austerity bites a bit a lot, like Italy or Greece or Spain, but it's also true for core European countries. There's a lively debate that actually led to the good performance of the Green Party at the recent elections. There is a lively debate in Germany on the poor state of the stock of public capital since 2000, since domestic demand was compressed by the German government. And you may remember there was this very interesting and quite remarked chapter of the IMF World Economic Outlook in 2014 that noticed how public investment in the current environment of very high public capital productivity and very low interest rates would eventually pay for itself and so lead to a decrease of debt to GDP ratio. This is a commercial. I'm sorry, Sergio, it's a commercial for my own work, but I mean, I take the liberty of doing it because it's Creative Commons. We have no copyright on that, and so and it can be downloaded for free. And so I don't feel that I'm making money out of this conference. It's just I'm just invite you to go and you Google them. We started a series of public investment outlooks that we would like to be a yearly publication. So far, we managed to do it 2020 and 2021. It's me and two colleagues from Germany and from Italy. So it's the three largest Eurozone countries that are involved. And these outlooks try to make a state of the art of public investment, and then they have some thematic chapters on the most important issues. I mean, there are 30 contributors for each of them. And so I invite you to go and read them. I repeat, I don't make any money out of it, so I don't feel guilty about this commercial. Industrial policy is back in town too. It has always been there. If you think of the work of Mariana Mazzucato and others, I mean, it never disappeared, but it's now becoming mainstream again. And it's what is important, I think, is that the industrial policy is now seen just, of course, much more than competition policy, the old European doctrine, but also much more than just building big oligopolies. The European champions that the French and German minister a few years ago argued it should be. And it's now understood that industrial policy is a multidimensional policy. It of course, can take the form of taxes and incentives of different types of regulation of trade rules, of course fostering competition, but also monetary policy, the investment, for example, in green bonds, that is quite controversial. I don't have an opinion myself on whether the ECB should engage in financing the ecological transition, but the fact that we discussed it shows how it can be used, monetary policy, as a tool for industrial policy. Of course, the managing finance policies on to reduce regional income disparities, and so on and so forth. So it is now clear that if we want to really have the state government as an active actor into shaping the future economic development of the economy, we need to put in place an industrial policy that has not just a single dimension. With all these changes, as I said before, our institutions seem like they really didn't age well. Okay, so there has been quite an important discussion I will be done in 5 to 10 minutes. There's been quite an important discussion that started actually before the crisis with a European Fiscal Board assessment of the Stability Pact that was surprisingly harsh. The European Fiscal Board say that the current setup, the Stability Pact and the Fiscal Compact, is procyclical. It's built on measures that are difficult to measure, most notably potential output and the output gap. It has become baroque, and it needs to actually keep track of so many variables that it's almost impossible to enforce. And we all remember governments, including our own government in the past, going to Brussels and bargaining for a 0.2, 0.3 additional deficit. You may remember the 2.4, 2.04 of a couple of governments ago, and it is of course very much biased against investment. Investment is more invisible expenditure. It's much easier to cut investment than to cut current expenditures. All of these things, I repeat, were highlighted. I mean, many independent economists had been saying that since 1997 actually, but it's quite significant. In 2019, so before the pandemics, the European Fiscal Board, and that was mostly the work of Massimo Bordignon, did embrace these criticisms, and these criticisms were the basis for the launching of a consultation process by the Commission in February 2020. I underline February because the Commission started the discussion, the consultation on the reform of the pact before COVID. The reform of European fiscal rules is not a making of the pandemics. It's a making of the global financial crisis and of the finally conscience that the European institutions have that the management of the Greek crisis has been a disaster. Before going into what will, in my opinion, happen, let me try to be idealistic and say what would be my fiscal governance for Europe. Well, my fiscal governance for Europe would be a fiscal governance with no rules. In my ideal world, the European semester would actually take its original role of being a place for coordination, which finance ministers and governments would meet with the European institutions and try to assess what are the common needs, how these common needs are to be made compatible with the needs of individual countries, and then determine altogether the fiscal policy of each of the member countries with in mind the appropriate stance for the Eurozone, the appropriate stance for individual countries, and of course the sustainability of fiscal policy. And so that would be an ideal world. As you can, this is somewhat what also Blanchard et al. Propose when they say that we should scrap the 3% and 60% and adopt standards, even if they have a quite cumbersome monitoring and sanctioning scheme that, in my opinion, would not work. But I mean, the idea would be that in an ideal world, we don't hang ourselves to targets, to numerical targets, but we actually try to boost coordination of fiscal policies. We have plenty of places where our governments can discuss with the European institutions. Of course, that is as ideal as impossible to obtain. Numerical targets will not be scrapped. I mean, I would even take away the unlikely. I wrote yesterday in a moment of optimism. I don't think we will have a new fiscal rule without numerical targets. And actually, what I think will happen, even given the investment needs that I mentioned before, is that the European countries will agree on some sort of golden rule. There are many proposals out there, so I don't know what will happen eventually, but I think the idea that we should protect investment by taking away from the rule, from the numerical target, is, in my opinion, an idea that has some political space, and most probably it will be the ending point of the compromise that will be found by the Commission. The advantages of the Golden Rule, I don't need to tell you here. I mean, I can just enumerate them. It allows to align the assets and the liability side of the patrimonial sheet of the country. Basically, the stock of debt to GDP tends to converge to the stock of capital to public capital. It is intergenerationally fair because it is true that we leave to future generation debt, but we also leave them capital, and so it's fair that they pay for part of the capital they will be using. And of course, it takes away the burden of fiscal consolidation from capital expenditure and puts it on current expenditure. It has been criticized. I mean, it's a proposal that has been around for at least 20 years. It has been actually implemented, for example, in the UK in the 1990s. It has been criticized on quite reasonable grounds. The first is, of course, it introduces a bias on physical capital. There is no reason to believe, for example, that paying the wage of a doctor or of a nurse would be less important for future growth than building a roundabout or a highway. And second, that the classification of expenditure might actually lead to creative accounting, greenwashing, etc., etc. Okay. My point is that these weaknesses could and should actually be turned into strengths, and I go a little bit back to my idea that we need coordination of countries. I proposed a few years ago, and also with Kemal Dervish, even before, in 2014, actually, the idea of what we called an augmented fiscal rule. And the idea would be that the determination of what can be financed without respecting the limit is not physical, tangible investment, but it is anything that is agreed upon by member countries and by the Commission, European institution. So the Golden Rule would become an instrument for this common industrial policy I was mentioning before. Say every electoral cycle, member countries, the Council, the Commission, the Parliament agree on a set of priorities. For example, take what we are doing now, green transition and digital transition, and they decide that these expenditure, regardless of whether they are classified from an accounting point of view as physical capital or current expenditure, this expenditure would actually be allowed without be subject to the limits. And in some sense, we could use the idea, the blueprint of the guidelines of the Commission for the Next Generation EU as a blueprint of what would look like the implementation of such an augmented fiscal Golden Rule. My bet is that we will go towards a Golden Rule. That Golden Rule will look like the proposal by two Bruegel economists, Darvas and Wolf, who actually argue that we should take away all the climate change related investment from the from the Stability Pact. It would be a very good first step. It would recognize that not all expenditure was born equal. That is important. In my opinion, that might not be enough from a quantitative point of view to give countries the fiscal space they will need to manage the challenges I mentioned before. So I think if this is where we go, I would then be very keen to see the debate on the central fiscal capacity to complement governments' fiscal policies to advance much more quickly. It is a debate that is not so easy, actually, because even if we succeed with Next Generation EU, so even if we force the frugals to admit that common expenditure could be a good idea, we face quite a number of issues. For example, how to finance this expenditure. I mean, think of all the debate on the taxation of multinationals. We are seeing progress, but at a very slow pace, and on how to spend it and on what to spend it. And of course, these are all questions that are quite difficult in the current setup, because if you imagine that this expenditure capacity is brought up to the central level, the democratic accountability that remains with the member states. And so we risk having a problem of democratic deficit. Who decides what will this public investment agency put the money on? And that is, of course, something, I mean, I'm all for the creation of a central fiscal capacity that needs to be very carefully designed in order to make sure that I, as an Italian citizen voting for the Italian parliamentary elections, have a saying on where my money and what my money will be spent on. Otherwise, of course, we risk increasing the drift between Europe and the public opinions. Okay. Regardless of whether we go central or we increase the fiscal space of
just 5 minutes,
and even less than what I need. I have 2 more slides. Regardless of what we will decide, so whether we will decide to go with a central fiscal capacity, at that point we could have constraining rules for member states, or we go with the idea that most fiscal policy needs to be kept at the national level, and so we have a radical reform of fiscal rules. Wherever we find that fiscal space, of course, we will need to have we will need to address the issue of the financing of this fiscal capacity and of the ensuring that this fiscal capacity comes with financial stability. Debt is here to stay. I mean, this is just the difference of increasing debt between 2008-2009, the red bars, and 1920, the yellow bars. As you can see, it exploded, and it's not going to disappear anytime soon. I don't think that this is a major problem, because, as I said before, I still believe that we are really in a situation where interest rates will remain low for the foreseeable future. And so that will allow us to move from the perspective of paying off debt to the perspective of servicing it, to roll over debt forever. Let's not forget that states are not households, they're not housewives, and so they don't need to balance their books. They can actually roll their debt forever. But, and this is where I will end my this talk, if solvency is not going to be a global issue, because we will have a situation where interest rates will be lower than the growth rate globally, it might become an issue for individual countries. The fact that we globally don't have a public debt problem does not mean that we don't need to think about how to make sure that individual countries don't face a market pressure and a sovereign debt crisis. A first option to make sure that this doesn't happen is to just keep the status quo. The ECB keeps the bonds in its belly, the COVID debt in its belly. It will keep it forever, rolling over every time it comes to maturity. It's not necessarily inflationary for the reasons I was saying before. There is an excess savings around there, so there is no reason why we should see inflation appear. And if it's done properly, so it is not imposed by the political powers, but it is an autonomous choice of the ECB, there is no risk of fiscal dominance or the loss of credibility of monetary policy. So there is those who say that the monetization of the rolling over of debt would not be possible. I think they don't. They're wrong. That said, I don't think that would be my favorite option, because that rolling over of debt can be stopped at any moment if the ECB finds it useful. So in some sense, the public debt of individual countries would not be shielded once and for all from market sentiment. And so the risk of markets feeling that a country has unsustainable debt will not disappear. Plus, the ECB, by rolling over the debt, basically cannot focus on its core business, and its core business would be to close the inflation gap and hopefully also closing the output gap. So my preferred view is to get this management of the EMU debt outside of the ECB, and that would have lots of benefits. We would provide, if an agency was created, we would provide a safe asset to markets. We would eliminate the risk for individual countries, thus increasing their fiscal space. We would free the ECB from the need to keep spreads down, and it could focus on its core business. And a secondary important fact is that we would normalize the yields of the EMU core yield countries that now are the safe assets for European savers, and so that would maybe stop these negative rates that are creating so many headaches, for example, to the German pension funds. And to do that, nevertheless, in order for that proposal to be viable, we need to be sure that there is no debt mutualization, that we do not eliminate the fundamental risk of countries, so we don't create the opportunity for countries to have moral hazard. Last but not least, that we don't make markets unstable by creating debt that has different ratings, that would create, of course, financial instability. The existing proposals that are on the table now fail to satisfy one or more of these criteria, with one exception, which is the last slide I will give. It's a proposal by Massimo Amato and co-authors that came out last October, and on which I recently also, with Massimo, produced a paper that came out a couple of days ago. And the idea would be to create a debt agency that would be endowed with capital to make sure it is solvent, and it would act as a sort of layer between states and markets. It would issue bonds, and it would lend. It would issue perpetual loans to member states, and that would allow it to filter the refinancing and liquidity risk. Countries can refinance themselves every time they need to. They can redeem that debt whenever they want, but they're not forced to do it because these loans are perpetually. And progressively, all their outstanding debt, as it comes to maturity, is absorbed into the agency, so there is no juniority of this debt that is not within the agency. The most important part of the proposal is in the pricing of the installments. The pricing of the installments would reflect the fundamental risk. So how much the country pays to service these loans will depend on the price that takes into account the possible weakness of the countries and the sustainability of its public finances and its compliance to the rules. And that would be decided by the Commission. So that the agency would be a technical body that it would be helped by the in its pricing by the political process deciding on the sustainability of that. And that would keep the accountability of states intact, and so we would have no moral hazard. And of course, I wrote with Massimo the paper, so I think their proposal is actually very good. So just to list you the benefits. First of all, whatever road we will take on the debate on fiscal governance, different rules, the development of central capacity, a mix of the two, whatever will happen, such an agency would actually have a role in managing the stock of public debt. It would stabilize market expectations, and as I said before, it would clearly divide the technical aspects of managing the debt with the political assessment on the sustainability of debt that would remain in the hands of the European institutions and on their interaction with member countries. And I stop here, and sorry, I took 5 minutes more than I was supposed to.
Thank you, Francesco, for your very interesting outline of the evolution of macroeconomic theory in the last years, and also for the proposal about the reform of European institutional setting, and also for having shown us that there has been something good coming from the pandemic crisis. There is the change in the rule of game. We have not too much time, but if there is some question from the audience.
If I can.
Yes, yes, Antonella.
Francesco, thank you. That was interesting. As usual, in our debates, you are more optimistic than I would be, but this is not the point. Just one thing, you said a lot of things, but there was one at the end that quite surprised me when you said that the European Commission should decide about the interest rate to be applied to states by the debt agency. Isn't that a bit dangerous in the sense that for some countries, especially for Italy, the interest rate is a crucial variable for the sustainability of everything, I would say. So if suppose the citizens of Italy vote a government, elect a government that doesn't, that is not in a good feeling, in a good relation with the Commission, what would happen? Would that affect? I mean, we have seen already things like that. Although the government that the Commission doesn't like, often I don't like either, but this is not how democracy should work, okay? So we have seen already how different governments get treated differently from the European institutions, basically for political reasons, not for any sort of solid economic reason. So I think this is a bit dangerous. Okay, the other question, of course, is that it is much debated whether this debt agency, the role of the debt agency should be taken by the European monetary system, the EMS, of course, this is also a problem because this is done without a deep change in the rules that govern this institution. That would be a problem. Okay, finished.
Thank you, Antonella. There is also a question from Gennaro Zezza, Gennaro?
Thank you.
Very short question, please.
Very short question. Thank you,
yes.
Francesco. Nice talk. Only a minor point. When you discussed the golden rule, you said that the burden of consolidation should fall on current expenditure. Why not on the tax revenue side? Because I think that shrinking current government expenditure is not going to work.
Thank you, Gennaro. I have also a question from Francesco. Why not to discuss also the reform of the European Central Bank? Because I mean that in order to assure the sustainability of public debt, you need the monetary policy, and so you need also to reform the European Central Bank. But you do not mention anything about this in your presentation. Because it's true, the public debt can be always roll over, but if you have a central bank that acts as in Japan or in the United States in a different way with respect to what happened here in Europe, the game is different in a sense. Okay, so you have just 10 minutes, 5 minutes, no more, because we have also the parallel sessions that must start.
Absolutely, I will stick with the. So first with Antonella, I start from the easy part of your question, which is the ESM. I mean, if we had to think of something like that agency that Massimo has developed, then we need to deeply reform the institution. So there needs to be a treaty change. That treaty change can be a treaty change on the function of the European Union. So we make that institution a European Union institution. We need to be very careful about this Article 125 about the prohibition to finance countries or institutions. It could be a reform ESM. The idea would be just to use the ESM in Italian we say ente inutile. ESM has become an ente inutile, so instead of keeping it there doing nothing, we transform it. But of course it would need to be transformed. And to go in the direction of what you were saying, of course it would be transformed. It would need to be transformed, taking it away from the 2 and 6 pack as it is now. So it would really need to become a very different institution. I just want the money, the capital of the ESM for the agency. But I mean, the idea is, whatever the political compromise on how to build it, suppose it was decided to follow Amato et al. And build this agency, a way should be found, but of course it would have nothing to do with the current form of the ESM if it was a reformed ESM. And so there would need to be a strong change. Okay, and that leads me to the second thing. The interest rate would be decided by the agency. And I was very careful when I was speaking about the wording I used. Okay, the determination of the sustainability of that, so of the fundamental risk of the country, would need to be the result of a political, underlined 5 times, interaction between the Commission, the Council, and member countries. We should not, precisely for the reasons you said before, we should never believe that deciding on the desirable level of public debt of a country is a technocratic endeavor. It is a political process. So we will need to reform the rules, to reform our way of coordinating ourselves, to think of the European semester in a certain way. This is maybe where I'm more optimistic than you. I'm not even sure I'm more optimistic than you, actually. But we will need to think of a way to say, okay, let's assess what is the risk that a certain country at a certain moment poses on its partners because of its fiscal policies. That then would be translated into a technical decision on the interest rate by the agency. But the political process remains a European process in which the country, the Council, and the Commission need to play a role. And of course, we all agree that the role they played up to now was very far from being satisfying. You mentioned a few cases, but let's forget Italy. Just think of what was done with Greece between 2010 and 2015. So I was very careful when speaking, because I think it's a political process. You cannot assess debt sustainability exclusively on a technocratic base. Coming to Gennaro, I totally agree, and this is why I mentioned this idea of deciding what should we protect as expenditure. It could be current expenditure. It could be tangible capital, etc., etc. And once we protect that, then we can work out how to make sure that the deficit doesn't explode by using revenues, by using other expenditure that we decide not to protect because we don't think it's more relevant, etc., etc. I by no means say that we only should balance the budget by reducing expenditure. I don't think I never thought about it. It's just also a question of what expenditure we should protect more. Last but not least, on Sergio, I didn't mention ECB reform because it's not a topic for discussion right now. I have always been in favor of formally adopting a dual mandate for the ECB. I must also say that since the famous whatever it takes, since 2012, I myself think this is less urgent. The ECB, whatever its formal mandate is acting de facto as a dual mandate central bank. So I take your point. We are in a moment in which we are rethinking everything, and so the ECB should be part of the conversation. I agree with you. If it's not, I mean, I prefer that we have good fiscal rules and we maybe find a way to manage that agency or something, rather than spend endless time discussing the ECB, because the ECB de facto is a dual mandate central bank. And with the strategic review of last July, even more so. Once again, would be nice to have it part of the conversation. I don't think it's the major topic for a discussion today. That is my view.
Thank you, Francesco. I would like to apologize with Roberto Romano. I have not seen that he did a question on the chart. Perhaps, Francesco, you can answer there if you like. And thank you to everyone. And the parallel session is starting, so we continue our conference in the parallel session. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Grazie a tutti. Thank you very much.
Grazie Francesco, bellissima presentazione veramente, grazie.